Hi and welcome to my channel. I've been asked by a few people how I make my decision as to whether I'm going to do a wheelie landing or a 3-point landing with my tail dragging Sherwood Kub. So although I'm not an instructor, I'm going to tell you how I go about my choices of what I do and how I do it. So let's see how we get on in the video. Let's talk about the sort of choices which I have for landing a tail dragger aircraft. I can either do a wheelie landing where just the mains touch down and I keep the tail off, or I can do a 3-point landing, in which case the mains and the tail wheel should touch down roughly the same time in a fully stalled configuration. In fact, normally I fly in on my approach with generally a light wind straight down the runway type scenario with 2 stages of flaps, 50 to 55 miles an hour. Normally if it's a nice light wind day and it's not too gusty, it'll be close to the 50 miles an hour, and I'll descend down. I usually start a little bit higher than would be a normal glide approach sort of setup, and I'll have a little bit of power on the aircraft and actually slip it down. The reason for that is I'm flying a 2-stroke, and prolonged periods of time with the throttle on idle means I'm not getting much fuel into the engine, and the engine only gets its lubrication from the fuel. So 3,600 to 3,800 RPM on the engine, usually in a slight forward slip of some description. I come down, I get to about 50 feet, I will usually straighten up, so I'm straight down the runway, removing all the slip. That's about the height where we tend to get the biggest wind gradient. And as I come over the fence, I'll pull the throttle back to idle, and I've slowed the aircraft down normally to around about the sort of 45 mark. I will hold off from my round out. I'll hold off, I'll keep holding off, putting back on the stick, and just keeping the mains just above the runway, and then at about 30 to 35 miles an hour airspeed, the aircraft will touch down, normally mains and tail all together. When will I use a wheelie landing? Well, generally I use wheelie landings more often than not for if I'm going to land on a rougher surface to protect the tail wheel. If I'm landing on stubble fields and things like that, or in a crosswind. And I've got plenty of runway. I will use probably about 50% more runway on a wheelie landing than I would do in a 3-pointer. For example, so this would be a sort of flapped crosswind landing setup. So again, my approach is still the same, 3,600, 3,800 RPM, 50 to 55 miles an hour, 2 stages of flap. The only difference is as I come over the fence here, I don't reduce the power I by much, maybe a couple of hundred RPM at the most. And I try effectively to bring the aircraft down, round out, and fly along the runway. But with that power setting I cannot maintain the height with the drag factor of the flaps and things in level flight, and the aircraft will slowly reduce its altitude down, so my vertical component is relatively small, because if it was high with the main wheels being in front, it would bounce and I'd end up getting into some real horrible situation. So I want a low vertical speed as I go down, and it's almost like the main wheels touch as a surprise. As soon as the main wheels touch, I ease the stick forward, not right forward to try and pitch the nose down, but ease the stick forward to help pin the aircraft and keep the tail up, and I cut the throttle back to idle, all in the same movement. And as it trundles down, the tail will drop. I'll start adding more and more forward force until eventually the tail is on the ground. I can't hold it up. I'll then pull the stick to the rear and to keep it pinned on the ground at that point. People flying 3-axis aircraft have a couple of methods of flying their approach for a crosswind. One sort of setup is to do what they term the crab, which is where the aircraft is turned slightly in towards the wind, not fully in line with the wind, otherwise you'd be flying up the wind. You'd have to drop a wing to fly along the runway. So it's if I put the wind at sort of 45 degrees, it'll be a mixture, and the faster the aircraft is, the less it'll be cocked off towards the wind. The slower it is, the more it'll be cocked off. And the idea is that you've got the route going straight down the imaginary centre line of our runway. I'd much rather do the wing low type approach. So I roll the wing into the wind, and then that'll make the aircraft want to turn. So to stop that turning tendency, I put in opposite rudder, and therefore we are actually in a unbalanced flight situation, so we are slipping. And the advantage for me of this is I'm coming down from a slightly steep height. Should my engine fail, I can immediately go into a sort of crab approach, best glide, and just stretch that glide out a little bit. I don't need to worry about it. But I can fly in efficiently with that side slip on with a bit of power, and I can still maintain a good glide slope all the way down and control it. And I'm controlling my descent rate with power, and I'm controlling my speed with pitch. That's one of the other main things. As I come over the fence and things, I have my power at that sort of 3,600 or so. I'm keeping the wing to stop me from drifting one side or the other, so I can do that quite rapidly. I'm looking at my nose and the far end of the runway to make sure I'm straight, and I'll touch down one main wheel first, possibly. My stick will go forward. I'll keep it still over towards the wind. I'll keep it to the, in this case, to the right, and I'll try to keep the tail up. I cut the power, and then as the tail and that drops, the stick starts to go forward, and it gets further and further off towards the wind. And as soon as the tail actually meets the ground, the stick comes straight back, still remaining over towards the side the wind's coming from. That gives me the benefit of adverse yaw and things to help keep the aircraft relatively straight down the runway and stop it to wanting to weathercock into the wind. It gives me really good control in that format. I'll always still turn away from the wind, because by turning away from the wind I have to lower the wing into the wind, and when I actually get down to a lower height and I want to straighten out, I've only got to change my angle very, very slightly, to be aligned with the runway. If you turn across towards the wind to do a similar slip, you're going to have to overslip it by quite a chunk, and now you've got a much greater angle to which you have to turn to straighten up to fly down the runway. For the same descent rate, so the same slip, bank and yaw, to get the same descent rate, you'd end up having a much greater angle to change to get back into line to go along the runway. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please hit the thumbs up. You can subscribe or even hit the little bell notification for future videos. Any comments would be appreciated, and I'll try to get back to you as soon as I can. Remember, go fly and feel the sky.